Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. We are honored to have Professor Joseph Zeira joins us as today's distinguished podcast guest. Dr. Joseph Zeira serves as a professor of economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His main area of research is macroeconomics. He specializes in economic growth, technology, and its adoption across countries, income distribution, and its relationship to macroeconomics, money and inflation, and the economy of Israel. In addition to his academic research, Professor Joseph is involved in public policy in Israel. His primary activity is with the AIX group, where Israelis, Palestinians, and international participants study together the economics of the peace process. In today's episode, Professor Joseph Zeira discusses key insights from his acclaimed book, The Israeli Economy, a story of success and cost. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joseph Zeira to the conversation. Professor Joseph, thank you for joining us. It's a true honor to have you on Business Talk today.
It's my honor to be here as well.
Thank you. Professor, your book frames Israel as a unique laboratory of large shocks like immigration, wars, peace treaties that make economic mechanism easier to isolate. What is the single most important natural experiment in the Israeli case? And what does it teach economists studying other countries?
Well, it's very hard. As I told you, immigration and wars and peace agreements all play a vital role. But I could say that one of the most important experiments that really looks like a natural experiment is the peace with Egypt that was signed around 1980. And you could see that it enabled us to have a real stabilization of the economy and to reduce the huge public costs that we had before because of the conflict. And there are many interesting things. First of all, it showed that this was really what enabled us to stop the high inflation that we had. At the beginning, people thought that inflation was stopped by many changes in policy, but actually the main change was the peace with Egypt that enabled us to stabilize the economy not only in the short run in 1985, but rather in the long run. The second thing that it shows is that economic growth is not really strongly affected by the size of the government, by the size of public spending. Because before the peace with Egypt, public spendings were around close to 80% of GDP. And then they went down to around 40% of GDP around today. And this was a huge reduction in public sector by almost half. And the rate of growth didn't change much as a result. It was the same. The long run rate of growth was something like 1.7% a year of GDP per capita. So economic growth wasn't affected significantly by these reductions in public spendings. And that's an interesting experiment. But we had many other things that changed over time that also we could learn a lot from them. And the main thing is that what people call the miracle of economic growth in Israel, which I show in the book, it was not a miracle at all. It was simply according to economic theory, but with a special type of immigration. The immigration to the country was immigration of people who were mainly from the middle class, and they brought a lot of money with them. And that enabled, especially during the times of the British Mandate, from 1922 to 1947-48. And that enabled the high economic growth during that period. The fact that we could finance the economic growth not by saving, but by money from outside. or unilateral transfers. And then, indeed, at the beginning of after 1948, the immigrants came without money, but not for long, because in 1952 we signed the reparation agreement with West Germany, and that enabled us to grow again with money that comes from unilateral transfers from abroad. So we grew up significantly during 50 years. That is the success part of the story. We had a high economic growth for 50 years, from 1922 till 1972. And then it stabilized at a more standard rate. But during these 50 years, Israel has grown at an annual rate of 5% a year, 5% of GDP per capita, which was impressive. But it was done thanks to the injection of finance from outside, first by the immigrants and then by the German reparation money. So, no miracle.
Professor, the title of the book highlights both success and cost. When you look back over the long arc of Israeli economic history, which success came with the highest hidden cost, and why is it often mixed in public debate?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. The title highlights both success and cost. When you look back over the long arc of Israeli economic history, which success came with the highest hidden cost, and why is it often missed in public debate?
Well, as I told you before, the success was indeed the high rate of economic growth during 50 years. But this was not something extraordinary. It was mainly catching up with the Western world, because we started with a much poorer economy, and then we succeeded to catch up with the other countries by simply expanding our education on the one hand, catching up technologies, taking technologies that were already invented, but we adopted them off the shelf, and with the fact that we had a lot of finance from abroad, as I explained a moment before. So that was one success. Actually, there was another success. There was a success and it was due to politicians, by signing the peace agreement with Egypt. Because before that, the Israeli-Arab conflict was very costly. We had a conflict not only with the Palestinians originally, but with all the neighboring Arab countries, and mainly with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. So as a result, the wars were very expensive, and they cost us a huge fiscal trouble. We had during the high time of this conflict, between 67 and 1980, between the Six-Day War, where we conquered areas from all these three countries, until 1980, when we signed the peace agreement with Egypt, our overall fiscal expenditures were around 75% of GDP. And the income of the government was lower. So we had an overall average deficit of 15% of GDP. And that was a huge cost and a huge trouble, because that also caused the debt to increase. And also, since part of the deficit was financed by printing money, that also caused a high inflation. And the economic success that was brought by the peace with Egypt was amazing, because it really helped us to stop the inflation, to reduce the debt, and it reduced the overall cost of the government significantly. What the government did with this is a different question. We could have shifted the resources to other social services, or to reduce taxes. And the government chose only to reduce taxes and didn't add anything to the other social services. But that's an issue that's related to the internal economic policies of the governments since 1980, since the peace with Egypt, which is something like 45 years ago.
Professor, you describe a 50-year catching up growth phase, roughly
Yeah,
the 1920s to early 1970s. What were the
exactly.
decisive ingredients of that rapid growth, and which of them are replicable for today's developing economies?
I will start with the end of your question. I'm sorry to say that it cannot be replicated by other developing countries because most developing countries lack the main thing that we had, which is an inflow of finance from outside. That enabled it. You have to remember, in 1948, when there was an influx of immigrants who there were after the Second World War, there were many refugees, Jewish refugees in Europe who wanted to come but couldn't come because the British didn't enable the immigrants to arrive to the country. And then after 48, there was also another kind of immigration. So in 1948, when the state was declared, we enabled these people to come from the refugee camps. And then we had also people who were coming from the Arab countries because they realized that they couldn't stay in their own countries if Israel was in war with these countries. So we had an influx of Jews. Within 3 years, the population of the country doubled from 600,000 Jews to almost 1,200,000. And the needs were enormous. And in the first years, between 48 and 52, there was no financing from outside. So the country went into a huge crisis, economic crisis, and we couldn't grow. For 4 years, growth stopped, and it was terrible, and it reached a recession as well. You know, in 1952, the government decided that it would stop a lot of the investment projects that it led. And then in 52, when Israel signed the reparation agreement with Germany, growth was resumed again. So this shows you that the importance of the financing from outside was crucial to the rapid economic growth. And most developing countries find it hard to receive such good payments from abroad, mainly because they don't have immigration, and definitely they don't have immigration of people who come from relatively rich countries and who are middle class in these countries. You know, we had migration in the 20s and the 30s from people from Eastern Europe, but also people from Germany. And these were people who had some resources. Nowadays, if you look at the picture of immigrants around the world, they are mostly very poor immigrants who bring their own human capital and their own ability to work, but do not bring with them a lot of finance. That was not the case in Israel. So it is very hard to replicate it. And I would caution everyone who reads the book to see carefully what lessons can we learn from Israel that are can be used, and what are the lessons that are different that we should learn from our experience, but we will not be able to use it as a simple recipe. Only under very specific conditions that usually are not the conditions that face most developing countries.
Professor, your analysis emphasizes human capital and technology adoption. Off the shelf. How did education, skills, and technology diffusion interact in Israel? And what are the policy lessons for countries trying to translate schooling into productivity?
Okay, our economic growth in general, let's say it in general, economic growth is based on growth of what we call productivity, or sometimes we call it in economics total factor productivity. Now, total factor productivity usually consists of two main elements. One is level of education. The more educated people, the more productivity. And the second is technical progress, change of technology. Now, usually these contribute to a mild rate of economic growth because you cannot adopt new technologies, you have to wait till they are invented. So the invention of technologies is usually what really bounds the rate of growth. Now, that is not the case for a country that begins at a very low stage of technology. Such a country can more rapidly adopt technologies that were invented a long time ago, and this is how this economy can grow much faster. The problem is, of course, that you have to finance it. You have to finance both the expansion of the economy because you have to build schools, you have to train teachers, you have to expand the system, the economic system. That is very costly. So you need financing. And the same thing also for adoption of technologies. Most technologies don't come, in thin air. I give a few examples in my book. For example, the technology of using tractors in agriculture. You need to purchase the tractors. You need to import them. Or the technology of air traffic. You need to buy the airplanes. You need to invest in equipment. You need to build airfields. Or, for example, similar technologies like telecommunication. You need to build the telephone system, the grids, and the centers of communication and so on. So all these technologies do not come just as miracles. They come as some goods, some that you have to invest in. So that explains why I said before that having the financing is crucial for economic growth. It was crucial for what we succeeded to do. So the development of Israel benefited a lot from the fact that we had a significant amount of financing from outside. At the first period by the immigrants themselves, and in the second period where the immigrants were poor, by the German reparation money. And basically after 72, when we finished the process of catching up, we didn't need any more financing from outside because we were growing now at the same rate as the rest of the world. Before that, during the catching up, we were growing faster. That's the issue of catching up. So financing is crucial, but I want to highlight another issue. A lot of times, many politicians say that in order to grow fast, we need to give the ability for the private sector, for the business people, to develop things. That's true, but that's not the full picture. My research shows that the economic growth in Israel, 40% of it is attributed to the expansion of education. And the education system in Israel was completely in the public sector. So it was due to investment not of business people, but the investment of the government. And therefore the public sector shouldn't be ignored in the process of economic growth. it plays an important role. 40% of economic growth is not a small number.
Professor, a striking thread is missing capital, lower capital intensity, and a high risk premium that you link to conflict. Can you unpack this mechanism in plain language? And how strong is the evidence that conflict related risk depresses investment and productivity?
Well, let me say how my thought about it developed. I, I did work a lot on various costs of the conflict because the conflict is a big part of life in Israel. It's needless to say, we can see today, to my sorrow, that we're involved with a war with Iran, which personally I think it could have been avoided, but that's a different story. But let me go to the issue that bothered me. For more than 10 years, for 15 years already, economists in Israel were complaining that although Israel was catching up with the West, it stopped the catching up at a level that is below the US and below other developed countries. They called this problem the problem of low labor productivity. In other words, that output per worker is much lower in Israel than in other countries. And the question is why? So they were giving all kinds of answers that the workers in Israel don't have a good education, or that we have too much bureaucracy, or too much regulation, whatever. Many explanations, but without any proof. So what I did, I tried to look at it again, and I checked the level of capital in Israel. You know, usually economists think about the production function in the economy that consists of two factors of production. One is labor and one is capital. So human capital measures usually the quality of the labor. But I thought that the quality of labor in Israel is pretty good because we have a lot of years of education. Education levels are high. So I was checking the level of capital. And I calculated the way to measure it is actually by measuring the capital output ratio. In other words, you take the level of capital every year, divide it by the output, and you get an idea of how capital intensive the economy is. And I realized that we have an average in the private sector. I'm not dealing with the public sector because it complicates things a lot. So I looked at the GDP of the private sector, business sector, and I compared it with the US. And I could also compare it to other countries, but I compared it only to the US. So the ratio between capital and output in Israel is fluctuating around 1. The ratio is 1. The amount of capital is approximately equal to the amount of output. In the US, in the business sector of the US, this ratio is 1.6, which is much higher. Actually, in Western Europe, this ratio in the private sector is around 2, even higher than in the US. But I focused on the comparison with the US. Now, then I could calculate by how much the missing capital affects our output. And that's an easy calculation. Most economists believe that the production function in every country is very similar to what we call the Cobb-Douglas production function. So this is the analytical tool that most economists are using, and I use the same tool. And then I saw that if you have a missing capital at the level of 60% instead of 1.6, let's say, not 2 like Western Europe. Let's forget Western Europe for a moment. If we could have 1.6 capital output ratio like in the US, we could increase our labor productivity, our output per worker by 26%. So the missing capital explains a gap in labor productivity in output per worker of 26%, which is more than half of the existing gap, because the existing gap is something like 44% in output. So 26% is more than half. So more than half is explained by the missing capital. And then I ask myself the following question. Why do we have missing capital? So I use the same production function, Cobb-Douglas production function, in a standard economic equilibrium, and I saw that the result can only be because of the risk premium. Now I have to explain it. Sometimes people think about the risk premium as the report of the rating agencies, but that's a different risk. That's the risk to invest in the country's public bonds, public debt, which is the debt of the government. But I'm talking about another type of risk, the risk of investors, the risk to open a new business in a country. And that is measured by the capital output ratio. From the capital output ratio that I described before, you can measure it. So that means that if Israel has a capital output ratio of 1 and the US of 1.6, it means that our risk premium for investors, for business people, is much, much higher. Now, all this story is for over a long period since the 60s. Why is it that over more than almost 60, 70 years, we have a much higher risk premium? I don't have a proof, but it makes sense to me that the explanation can only be the Israeli-Arab conflict.
Professor, you distinguish between wide conflict like conventional wars and a narrow conflict, primarily Israeli-Palestinian. How did
Yes.
these two phases shape Israel's fiscal path and defense burden? And what should other countries learn about security shocks and public finance?
Well, I think that this distinction is more specific to Israel, but other countries can learn from it in a sense. What I'm trying to say is that until 1948, until the beginning of the state, the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs in the mandatory Palestine was a conflict between two national ethnic groups at the military level of militias. Such a conflict is not very expensive. And then after 48, when the Arab countries joined the conflict became a conflict between Israel and the neighboring Arab countries. All Arab countries, but the most important were the neighboring, which were Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Now, that is a conventional conflict is, of course, a much more expensive conflict because you don't fight with guns or with hand grenades or such ammunition. You fight with airplanes, ships, tanks, and so on. So definitely it became much more costly. Now, the costs were not very high most of the time. But once there was escalation in the conflict, for example, after the year 1967, because Israel conquered territory from all neighboring countries, then the conflict became much more costly. So before that, defense costs were something around 6-7% of GDP. But during the years of the high conflict, expenditures were around 20 to 30% of GDP. So 20 to 30% of our output, of our income, went to the army, to the military. These are huge costs. And there were additional costs that were not measured so, because, for example, it created a debt, and the debt created interest payments. That was very bad. Also, a lot of people went to reserve, people who are not so young, not in the conscription army. But in Israel, even people at the age of 30 and 40, when there is a war, they are recruited. They go to the war. And at the time, people went to the army for 3, 4, 5 months a year. So they had to leave their jobs. And the business people came to the government and say, help us. We need some support. So the support for the business sectors went up also. So many other costs increased. So in terms of fiscal burden, the wide conflict was very, very high. That was solved by the peace with Egypt that I mentioned before. Because after the peace agreement with Egypt, you can say that the wide conflict ended. Because any coalition of Arab states cannot form to fight Israel without Egypt. Egypt is the biggest country, the biggest army in the Arab countries. Without Egypt, there is no war between Israelis and the Arab countries. So after that, indeed, the Palestinians realized that they have to fight for themselves. No Arab country will help them. So in 1987, they started the first Intifada, and they started the conflict to regain their independence, which they didn't achieve until today. But that conflict was with a very low direct military cost. After the peace with Egypt, the defense costs went down from more than 20% of GDP to around 5% of GDP, which is very low. Even in the current war, it went up only to 8% of GDP, because we're not fighting against an army. We're most of the time, except for Iran, but even that is a limited army. We're fighting against militias, and militias are not really costly. So that distinction is important. But it's important also not to stop and say, okay, that's fine. We have no costs. We do have costs. We have additional costs. And also what happens is that the wars with the Palestinians happen to create significant recessions. Before that, we didn't have many recessions. After 1980, we are having a lot of recessions. Why? Because the wars, unlike the previous wars with the Arab countries that you had to win them fast because they were too costly to be long, the conflicts with the Palestinians take a lot of time. The first Intifada was around 4 years. The second Intifada was around 4 years. The current war is already almost 2.5 years, and it didn't end. So the conflicts with the Palestinians create a lot of uncertainty and high risk, and they also impact the civilian areas. In the first and the second Intifada, because of all kinds of suicide bombers, and in the current war because of missiles and rockets. So you have less activity within the economy, and it's becoming very risky, and therefore investments go down, which is usually a trigger for a recession. So the conflict with the Palestinians creates a lot of recessions. Let me give you an example which is not in my book. We now have a recession in Israel, a severe recession. It began in October 2023, when the current war broke up. The same way that I analyze it in the book, it happened again. A conflict with the Palestinians created a recession, and the recession is going on for 2.5 years already and didn't end yet. And you know, the GDP of the business sector declined. It's now 8% below the trend. A significant decline. And the investments are something like 20% below the trend. The only thing is that this recession doesn't have high unemployment. And you know why? Because many young people are recruited to the reserve service. So a lot of firms that could otherwise fire workers do not fire them because they have less workers anyway because people are going to reserve service. So that's the reason why we don't see data on unemployment going up, but we have a very deep recession.
Professor, the book uses Israel's experience to test macro theories, balance of payments, inflation, Phillips curve, disinflation. Which theoretical framework fit the Israeli data best, and where did theory struggle or need adaptation?
Well, actually, I don't think that in the case of Israel, at least, I don't think they need adaptation. All these theories prove themselves to work very well. I think the chapter I like most is the chapter on the balance of payments. Because in the early years of the state until 1980, we had a huge trade deficit of something like 30% of GDP, very big. And then it went down and is now close to zero. And the question is why? And the new theory of the intertemporal balance of payments, which was developed in the 1980s, claimed that it always happens when the macroeconomy has expectations for different levels of income in the future. So the discrepancy between the present and the future is what driving these deficits. And I thought to myself, what are these discrepancies in Israel? It's rapid economic growth because we believe that there will be more income in the future. So we consume more today on behalf of the future. It's the wars because we know that wars don't take forever. At some point they end. And immigration, because immigrants create a lot of investment in the country in the present and not in the future. So these things, I checked it statistically, and it shows that these things are indeed correlated with a high trade deficit. So the trade deficit gives a very positive booster to the intertemporal theory of the balance of payments that was developed by economists in the 1980s, economists that are still alive and around us. People like Jeffrey Sachs, Olivier Blanchard, uh, people like Lars Svensson, Maury Obstfeld, and so on, Kenneth Rogoff, all these people whom I met when I came after my PhD. I went to Harvard University to do a postdoc, and I met all these people, and they were developing these theories at the time. And then after many, many years, I realized that my country can be a fantastic example to these theories. And I was very happy about it.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. In the final part, you treat Israel as an intense, long experiment in neoliberal policies and argue the timings and drivers are tied to national challenges. What did the shift towards privatization and a smaller public sector actually change and not change in growth and inequality?
Well, that's true. In the last part of the book, I examine, let me tell you something, which is also related, and I mentioned it, but I want to stress it. After the peace with Egypt, a lot of the public sector declined. And there were many resources at the availability of the government. And the question is, what did the government do with it? They made a decision to run neoliberal policies, which meant that they will not transfer it to other public services, but only to reduce taxes. And what I show in this book, in this part of the book, is two things. First of all, that these policies did not have a positive effect on economic growth. They had no effect on economic growth. It remained as before. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is that they increased inequality in the country. Because the larger the public spending, the more taxes people pay, direct taxes. And direct taxes are usually progressive and they reduce inequality. So this mechanism of redistribution was very weak in Israel because the size of the public sector went down. So these are these two effects of no benefit to economic growth, but a reduction, an increase in inequality. So that's what I say, that the neoliberal policies are not necessarily a result of economic theory, are not necessarily a result of economic needs. They are a political decision of whether to redistribute income or not. And the governments made their own decisions, and we have to understand them, but they try usually to justify them by claiming that it can bring to higher growth. But the data shows that they didn't bring higher growth. These policies didn't change the rate of economic growth in Israel at all. And that's an important lesson for other countries as well. When people come to, let's say, to India and tell you that you have to reduce public services in order to enable higher economic growth in India, you can take them to many new research done recently, but also to my book on the Israeli economy that shows by a very nice natural experiment that this didn't work. It's a propaganda. It's not science. The science says that the effect is very small.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Today's discussion reminded us that economy isn't just a set of indicators. It's a living record of choices, shocks, trade-offs, and the institutions that absorb them. We explored how periods of rapid growth can be understood through familiar macroeconomic lenses, how policies paths shape outcomes over decades, and why the cost behind headline successes matter just as much as successes themselves. Is there a one takeaway to carry forward? Is that economic debates improve when we separate evidence from slogans, asking what the data can explain, what it cannot, and which decisions remain ultimately value-based. A sincere thank you to Professor Joseph Zeira for the clarity and candor, and to our listeners for staying us with through a nuanced, sometimes complex, but deeply important story. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to pick up a copy of The Israeli Economy, a story of success and cost from a bookstore near you. Until next time, thank you and take care. Thank you once again, Professor Joseph Zeira, for generously sharing your time and insight with our audience today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can I add one more sentence?
Sure, please.
Less than a year ago, my book was translated to Arabic and was published in Ramallah in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that made me very proud.
Wow, excellent. Congratulations, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.